as we kick things off sort of formally, my name is Michael Goldberg, for those who we have not met, and I'm the executive director of our Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship at Case Western Reserve, and I also am a professor in our Weatherhead School of Management, where I teach courses on entrepreneurship, and it's great to be with everyone today, and especially to welcome a good friend and mentor, Joe Keithley, to our series. The way that our sessions work is that we have student moderators, and we're thrilled to have Anamisha Krishnamurthy, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, who is also doing one of our remote entrepreneurship projects this summer. So she's interning with a local medical firm here in Cleveland, and is one of our 120 students that are participating, including 4 that are working with Arnold Huffman. Thank you, Arnold. So it's great to have Anamisha in our Veale Institute family, at least for the summer, and it's awesome to have our students get the experience of moderating. So I'm going to turn it over to Anamisha. She's going to be running the show today, and for those that are either joining on Facebook Live or in the Zoom, we're going to put you on the spot and hope to have you interact. So you can just let Anamisha know in the chat if you have a question, or raise your hand virtually on Zoom. But we hope to have this be really interactive. So with that, let me turn it over to Anamisha, and thanks, Joe, for doing this today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anamisha Krishnamurthy, and I'm a rising third-year biomedical engineering student at Case Western. I'll begin by introducing our speaker and asking a few questions. Please do let me know if you have questions throughout. Here's a little bit about our speaker, Mr. Joe Keithley. His initial college education was within the realm of engineering, and then after working for some time, he went back to school for his MBA and then joined Keithley Instruments, an electronic measurement and instruments company, where he later went on to become the CEO and president. He has also served on many public company boards as well, and as well as Case Western's Board of Trustees. Mr. Keithley, could you begin by elaborating a bit on your career journey and what made you pick this electronics field, and also go back to pursue business as well?
Let me say as well, I'm delighted to be here among you and to share some of my experiences and reflect on things. But how did I get to be part of the electronics industry? And I suppose if I would start with what did I do before I chose the electronics industry, that might give you some context. And I know that in this series, you had many people talk about their own experiences in being part of a startup company or funding multiple startup companies. And in my case, I began really through a father who started a company. And the company's name was Keithley Instruments, and the focus on the industry and what the company did, and I'll kind of march myself in through it, was my father got a technical degree, he got an electrical engineering degree at MIT in the 1930s, and during World War II, at the age of 25, was one of the early members of the Naval Research Labs. And he was charged with a project to define, develop, design, and then source, manufacture, and then distribute an underwater mine actuator. And this actuator, in effect, was undetectable and was, by the time it was employed in 1944 in the Tokyo Bay, and other spots in the Pacific, it was clearly for him an experience of having to do something that he hadn't done before, and he was quite enamored, frankly, with the new product process. So as part of what he was doing, which was using acoustic waves, he became acquainted with people in Cleveland who also were doing the same thing, which brought him first from Boston and then to Washington, D.C., and then into Cleveland. And he worked with those people for a while, but after a year or so, he chose to go on his own and began to develop an instrument which was an accessory to an oscilloscope. which had, among other things, a low price and a low unit volume, which means he had to find some other way to pay for his living while he further developed the product line. But then he had a family at the same time, and I'll then weave myself into this. So broadly speaking, Keithley Instruments is a designer, a marketer, and a manufacturer of precision electrical measurement instrumentation. And as Al Green was saying, it has been
lost
sold.
Your volume, I think.
Excuse me?
Go ahead. Now you're good, Joe.
Okay. The instrumentation was sold to people who are making sensitive electrical measurements to better understand the properties of their own materials or in designing circuitry of one kind or another. And the nature of the opportunity was that it was global and could easily be described as a business-to-business kind of an endeavor. You could also imagine if you're dealing with the ability to measure, for example, a thousandth of a millionth of an ampere, there aren't a heck of a lot of people who need that. So this was clearly a niche business. Some of our other speakers have talked about a product which might be ramped up to billions of dollars. Now, this wasn't the sort of opportunity that's there for the electrical test and measuring industry per se, but it's had lots of attractions, which I'll touch on in a minute. For my own career, which got me there, I grew up in Cleveland. I went through public schools in Cleveland, and I then went to Cornell, where I had both a bachelor's and a master's in engineering. It was operations research and industrial engineering. And I left there to join a company which coincidentally was a Cleveland-based company, Eaton Corporation. And I was a manufacturing engineer. So I could use directly the experiences that I had in college in my first job. And this Eaton Corporation was a global enterprise with lots of divisions, each of which made somewhat different things from another. And they had decided a few years before I joined that company in 1972 that they needed to raise their game in terms of manufacturing processes and process technologies. And so they endeavored to hire new college grads, and they had a whole pool of them. And every 3 months, this pool, which was called a Manufacturing Engineering Training Program, enabled each of us to visit and work in a site for 3 months or so, and then rotate on to another. And you could do this for a 2-year period before you were, in effect, assigned a division somewhere within the company. And I was able to choose different parts of the country and different manufacturing processes with different workforces. So just to give you a sense of it, I worked in the hoist division in Forest City, Arkansas, which is close to nowhere. And I worked out of Chicago with a division that made thermostats for cars. And so that was, if not millions of units, certainly hundreds of thousands of units. And then I worked at the Veale lift truck division in northern Philadelphia, where they made high-priced units and not very many of them. And it was an old unionized workforce. So I had the real opportunity to see lots of different problems that needed to be solved with respect to manufacturing engineering. But I determined after that first year that I wanted to get closer to customers. And I didn't necessarily want to rise from a career path to where I could be a general manager of a division. I wanted to do something more. At the same time, I wanted to understand what it was these different functions did when they were all working together. So I found myself as a market research analyst at the group level, where instead of having an immediate boss and his boss, be someone within a plant. I had projects where I was reporting to the president. And this was, at that time, was a $1 billion company. In today's dollars, that'd be a much larger company yet again. But frankly, after a year of doing that, I was fearful, as there was a downturn in the automotive industry, that the president, if he didn't already know, would find out that I didn't know much about marketing. So before he fired me, I decided to get an MBA, and I went to University of Michigan, where I then got the knowledge that I was looking for in terms of what are the relationship between the different functions of a company, and at the same time, when they're integrated, what does that integration mean? And as they try to grow, how does one go about doing that growth? By the time I was through with that, my father had said to me that he wanted very much to encourage me to join Keithley Instruments. And it was such a fine company, even though it was small, sales of about $8 million, that I thought this was an attractive opportunity long term. And so I went in that direction. And my first job at Keithley Instruments was manager of production and inventory control. So again, building on the technical skills that I had as a student in engineering, but beginning to deal with some of the business problems of supply chain, of variation in demand. And as I knew, to tell you more about Keithley Instruments from a conceptual perspective, it was serving the needs of customers whose demands changed as a result of what they were able to do through their own innovations in the semiconductor industry or their own pursuits in doing basic research in material science. And of course, the semiconductor industry, which in 1955 really was not existent to speak of. That's when the researchers in Bell Labs developed the first transistor, and later the people at Texas Instruments developed integrated circuits, and then the people at Intel began to put that together with a microprocessor, as did Motorola, and a whole world grew. So having this specialty technology capability that we had, serving people who the specifier was the user, who was well educated, and who himself was trying to solve problems which would be of great benefit to lots of people, we could have a very high gross margin. In other words, lots of value added. And at the same time, feel as if we were making a contribution to measurement science. And so that was a very satisfying experience, frankly. I mean, broadly speaking. And I must say that 3 months into my first job, there was a downturn, and I had my salary cut by 10%. So I was, maybe I wasn't, but my wife was questioning, what the hell did you get yourself into, Joe? But still, I went from that responsibility to move closer to customers. And to do that, I started off being a manager of customer service, and in fact had to install an automated order processing and customer management software. And I suppose I should have added right in the beginning, when I graduated from college, there was time sharing for a computer, but you didn't have a computer, which means the company you were in didn't have a computer. And you didn't have calculators because they hadn't developed the semiconductor devices that do calculators. So we were really constrained on what you could do from an applicability standpoint. But having done the customer service job, I then became a salesman, and in fact went to England and had a sales territory. I didn't know the product really, and I never had sold before. And of course, England was a different country, so I didn't know the customers at all. So those were 3 things I had to learn at the same time, but it was a wonderful experience. When I returned to the States, I was what they called a regional sales manager, because our instrumentation in some countries, like in England, was sold directly through our own sales force to researchers or to instrumentation heads of companies. But in the United States, the geography was big enough that we, and the sales small enough that there were independent sales representatives who would do that work on our behalf, and we would then have to oversee 2 or 3 of these organizations at the same time. So I did that. Another way for me to touch customers, understand what made them different from one another, and at the same time have an opportunity to see the value added that we were providing them. And kind of just to give you an early sense of some of what could be done as a salesman when I was in England. This was in 1979. Philips had developed microprocessors they'd installed in TV. So they had digital TV a good 20 years before it was rolled out in the United States. And then there was a unit that was part of British Petroleum that was making photovoltaic cells. So these are the first cell technology as an alternative to fossil fuels. This was a research center, but they were doing hundreds of thousands of these devices, and they needed our kind of instrumentation to help both characterize them and then to functionally test them as they began to be made. So I got to see the front end, if you will, of what was going to be happening in the electronics industry through the semiconductor industry. Enhanced, as I said, by being that sales manager, and from there became a product marketing manager. So this would be someone who would look at the product portfolio that we had, look at the customer base that was being served by it, and be thinking about what the next generation of product needed to be, and what the technology is that we would have to be able to employ it. And I did that for a couple of years, and that carried me on to being responsible for international sales. In between that, I both, bought a business as well as sold a business. And by 1993, I became the CEO of the company and ran the company. It had a market cap of about $40 million when I took over. And we sold the company in 2010 to a serial acquirer of companies, Danaher, which itself was a manufacturing company, but had come up with a financial model to increase its revenue and throw off a lot of cash so that they could acquire other companies. And they were continually on a path of looking for increased value added through higher gross margin companies. So they acquired Keithley Instruments, and that we sold that for about $350 million. So it was a nice growth over that 15 or 17 year period that I ran the company. From a personal experience standpoint, in addition to that, I've had the opportunity to both be on some nonprofit boards, one of which was particularly enriching, was joining the board of Case Western Reserve in 1992, and joined my first public company board in addition to Keithley Instruments in 1997, and a reasonably high-tech company in its effort. It was Materion Corporation here in Cleveland, and in 2001 joined another Cleveland-based company, Nordson, with, again, business to business, lots of applied technology, and a global reach. And then I joined Excelis Technology after I divested myself of Keithley Instruments. And Excelis Technology makes specialty semiconductor capital equipment company products to serve the semiconductor industry. So in a nutshell, I chose the electronics industry in large measure because I had the opportunity, and I could see that there's a very long flight path, if you will, because this is an industry which was on a high growth path, and at a minimum is incredibly satisfying to serve because of what it can do for so many people. And just one last thing on Keithley Instruments. One of the real attractions for me, frankly, was over the course of the years, we had 3 Nobel Prize winners in physics use our instrumentation as enablers for them to do their work, which they received the Nobel Prize for. So I may have rambled on a little bit, Anisha, but that's a thumbnail of not only kind of what I did, but what I might suggest someone with a technical degree who wants to be involved with companies that make things and stay with them for several years, how they can increase their responsibilities and stay close to customers. Because at the end of the game, what really counts in business is revenue. And revenue then is a function of you selling that customer something. And the reason they're buying from you is because they've got a problem and you're the best solution for that problem. And having that experience of thinking that through and then being rewarded by getting satisfactory revenue from which you can get not only good profits, but throw off cash, which gives you a chance to do something more in addition, is really a very satisfying experience.
Al, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, the first question, so who are the 3 Nobel laureates, if I could ask, please?
Oh, gosh.
Okay, I will put you on the spot.
But I would tell you that the first group was a Dr. Mueller, I believe, who would have been in Germany,
the
Max Planck Institute. The second was a gentleman who was, I think, part of IBM in Zurich, in Switzerland. And the last 2 were researchers at Manchester University in England whose work was on graphene. Okay,
interesting. Sorry about that, just to digress.
It's okay. And for the rest of you, graphene, just as an example, is a single atom hexagonal structure that the thought is as you pass electrons through, there's no resistance. So if you could use this as your cell structure for semiconductor devices, you would have much faster devices than we have today. And how would you know whether you have no resistance? Well, you've got to measure it. And this is where the involvement with Keithley Instruments came about. And in fact, I can't resist telling you a quick story on this. They received the Nobel Prize in 2010, which was the same year in which we sold the company. And what had happened is the 2 researchers had come to Cleveland in a collaboration with our applications and marketing people 6 months before then. So this was October. And in October, our team went back over to look at their measurement apparatus to see if it could be tuned and enhanced. And the 2 men were together in the laboratory with us, not with me, but our applications and marketing guy. And a graduate student came into the lab and said to the one professor, "You've got a phone call. I'm sorry to have to interrupt you on this." And he was profusely apologetic, and he said, "I'll be right back." And he came back, and he was a little sheepish, but there were lots of other people in the lab at that point, and they were all clapping for him. He said, "Sorry, I took the call. It was AP. We just won the Nobel Prize in physics. They're going to have to come out. I got to get a lot of photos. Shouldn't take more than a half hour and get right back to work."
That's awesome. I'll just finish asking my question real quick, or just a couple comments. Actually, I think one of the things that's really interesting in your experience, which I think is often overlooked from technologists, is the importance of sales and sales and processes, particularly as a company grows. you know, understanding, you know, a lot of times we technologists, it's so easy for us to get caught up in our technology rather than the customer, what the customer wants in the sales. Because a lot of times the customer really doesn't care about your technology. What they care about is that you can solve their problem. And so that's one of the things I'd say. The second thing is you did make the comment that, you know, the most important thing is revenue. And I would just add a slight twist to that from my own experience. That one of the things that's impressive about your story, I think, is I would say as equally as important to revenue as gross margins, because you know, as you drive revenue up, if you don't have sufficient gross margins, you're just going to get crucified by working capital requirements. And so I think that you know, when you were pointing out the fact that you had products that you could sell at high gross margins, I think that is really important for budding entrepreneurs to realize that early on you really have to make sure that you can sell what you're trying to sell at sufficient margins to create a business. Otherwise, it's a tough road. So those are my comments, and then thank you.
So Al, one, I completely agree with you, and two, I should have said that the revenue is the beginning enabler.
Right, it is.
But really, particularly for a small company, the head of that company feels every day, as you did and I did, you have to pay the salary at the end of the month to all these people who've given their careers to you. And well, that only comes about by having enough profits that you can do that.
Yeah, my thing was basically you have 100 mortgages. And it really puts things into a pretty brutal light when you think about, you know, every month it's 100 mortgage payments you got to make sure to satisfy. So
yes.
Great. Thanks, Al, for the question. I wanted to jump in with a question, Joe, and it's on a topic that you and I have discussed quite often as we've gotten to know each other at the university, and it's around the challenges that universities that are doing amazing research, including some of the types of research that you mentioned that folks are using Keithley instruments around, in commercializing that technology. I wonder if you could sort of share some of your insights, because this is something that you've seen both from a board of trustees point of view, from an industrial point of view. How can universities like our own or others sort of strengthen that pathway to commercialization?
Well, I think that it's very helpful for the faculty member who thinks he has that opportunity because he has an interest not just in public domain research, but wanting to see that technology be put to work somehow. Have the humility, if you will, as well as the burning desire to make it happen, that he's going to need friends. And that friends ought to be built into the construct of the university administration. So, as an example, it would be nice if there were, and the Coulter Foundation, I think, has done some of this, is to send people off who would like to learn about commercialization, really what's involved, so that they can take the first steps. But I think that whether it's someone out of the business school, or for a while we had very much people in the tech transfer office, and certainly in the medical school, actual people who've been in the industry who would have the contacts, as well as be able to say, this is an interesting technology that you have. It probably has 6 or 7 different poems. And it's going to take some time for it to get productized in some fashion to where we know that the home that would be most successful in the context of somebody willing to pay money for its use is there. So I think then to ask the faculty member to do this commercialization while he still has a responsibility for teaching and research may well be a few. But having a culture where you want to have not just licensing of the technology with existing companies, but I'm blanking on the term. But it's so I've for excuse me, invention disclosures.
Yeah.
And once you get the invention disclosures, then you can begin to have people look at it and say, well, that's interesting. Do you know so-and-so? So there's a good bit of networking. This is why I mentioned the tech transfer office and the couple of people that Pam Davis hired to move her whole program along. I think another that's very helpful in doing this really are business plan contests for faculty and for students. I think another one that's helpful that we have done is these research days, which have been, my memory is, in every April, where students and faculty could at Veale show in a small booth what it is that they're doing with other people walking around. So it's an exposure. And I think that in addition, there'll be a few faculty members who will really be leaders. They'll be the ones who more naturally gravitate towards doing this, and they're good at it. I think of Hunter Peckham as just one of many. And these leaders, I think, then can make a difference with their colleagues in helping them along as well. So if you will, the informal network as well as the more formal network. But at Case, back in the 1990s, tech transfer, as espoused by the president and the provost, was to have well-educated students get into industry. So really the transfer was knowledge-based, people-based, and that was it. And they were very risk-averse, the president and the provost, during that period. And they even had such they had patent officers as the skills of the tech transfer office. And so it was David Austin, when he came in, working with the then provost, I'm blanking who went down to Emory, Jim Wagner, rewrote what the job definition would be for the vice president of research, to put an equal emphasis on tech transfer as well as research administration. They still had the issue of they could be an advisor to all, but they didn't have leverage because they didn't have a large budget for themselves, and they didn't have a chance. I mean, their powers were ones of persuasion and collaboration. And at the same time, they were allowed to, and very much sponsored by Barbara Snyder, to have this commercialization being an important part of who we are. And where it really jumped out is not only for undergraduates who wanted the exposure, but newly arriving assistant professors who were expecting this to be part of who they could be. And so, if not for themselves, certainly for their spouse, who might also be similarly inclined to be doing research and commercializing it. And so it's those networking. And I think that's how we've then had the focus here of Michael and your, I've got to write, the Veale Institute of Entrepreneurship. I mean, that's very much what we're doing. There's nobody who's better at getting people to talk to them, understanding this, having done the experience of venture capital and done the connections with universities than you.
We're trying. We're trying.
Yeah.
And Amisha, back over to you.
Arnold, did you want to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Joe. This is Arnold Huffman, 93 graduate. You mentioned boards earlier on. Maybe talk a little bit about how you got onto the radar to be invited onto these boards, as well as the value of you participating on these boards.
All right. Well, I'll start off with the first board, which was a nonprofit board, and then I'll get to the more substantive for-profit boards. Just broadly, for those of you who haven't been part of nonprofit boards, they're composed of many people. They're on the board, among other things, because they like the product of the nonprofit, and somebody thinks they're willing to give some time and some money. But what's nice for a young person like myself, I was 36 when I got on the board of the Cleveland Playhouse. So this was a performing arts organization, was very good, was here in Cleveland. But the chairman at the time was the head of a large, similar to CVS or Walgreens. It was Revco at the time, and the guy's name was Boke Sells. And he was a tough guy, but he had a great style about him. And this was an opportunity for me, well before I was high in an organization, to see somebody who was far more competent and skilled, frankly, than my father or his president, who were really capable guys, but they were running a much smaller company. And to see how Boke would engage both the management team and engage his fellow board members. So that was the first really helpful learning experience for me. It was also interesting, just to put a plug in for another guy, one of my fellow board members who had just come to Cleveland, he was kind of my age, a guy named Sandy Cutler, who rose through the Eaton organization to be its CEO for 15 years. But you could see, and he started that in 2000, you could see 15 years earlier his leadership skills and where that was going to take him. So I hadn't really been exposed to people like that before. So that was a rich experience back in 1985. But the first for-profit board was Materion, and I was introduced to its CEO kind of in two ways, interestingly. So one was that one of my board members was friends with the CEO of Materion and was kind enough to introduce me to that man and say, I think Keithley be a good guy for you. At the same time, a guy who I had worked very closely with, Mohan Reddy at Weatherhead, when he was a new faculty member and I was head of marketing at Keithley Instruments, was doing consulting work for Materion. And so he, if you will, again, facilitated the relationship that got me on that board. And that company was maybe $500-600 million in sales and served a wealth of industries. But as Al was pointing out, the big issue that they've always had is their gross margins were 25%. So it was a little bit different in terms of where they provided their value added. But the board members themselves had interesting experiences, which helped me. It was fascinating when I joined the next board, Nordson. I guess I joined that board because of, I guess, not only the visibility that the Keithley Instruments had by 2001, but its founder was interested in bringing on younger board members. And the founder was, at that point, maybe 80, 82 years old, and still active, but not even as chairman. So he just, he says, look, I'm the founder, I'm the major shareholder, so I guess you guys are going to have to listen to me. But he was looking for someone who valued community, both within a company and kind of quite literally, so multiple stakeholder groups. And kind of my nonprofit experience caused him to say, gosh, Keithley seems like a good guy. So as well as the nature of our business and what Nordson did, the complete alignment in terms of how we would compete, where the gross margins would be, the value add of the technology, the fact that both of us had 70% of our sales outside the US. So there was a good fit from a number of different ways. And then the last company, Excelis Technologies, the CEO of that company was also on the board of Nordson. And she had joined the board at Nordson a few months before I did in 2001. So I guess in every case, I got on the board not because of a recruiter, but because of some sort of network that I touched in one way or another. In terms of what it did for me, it really makes a difference when you are on the other side of the table, opining and being reactive. In other words, somebody parachutes in 4 times a year, spends 2 days, and then leaves, is responsible for governance, but certainly isn't responsible for carrying the company forward. In a way, you get a lot of respect not only for the CEO, but you understand as the CEO of your own company, not only what board members are looking for. They don't like surprises, and they'd like to be helpful, and you are absolutely, they're 100% supportive of you until they're not, and then it kind of turns pretty quickly. So you have to, one, not have the surprises, but 2, work with them. And work with them between meetings as well as at the meetings. I was, at Nordson in particular, I had the wonderful experience of finding myself in the shoes of the Nom and Gov chairman when it became apparent that the management team was about to roll over. In other words, the CEO was going to retire, and most of his direct reports were going to retire all within the same year or so. And we hadn't had retirement restrictions on board members before, among other reasons, because the principal owner was well over 80, and so we kind of didn't have a requirement. But once he left the company, we tightened down in terms of the age at which someone might retire. So we found ourselves with having the board turnover at the same time the management team get to turn over. So I found myself reconstituting the board at the same time looking for a new CEO. That was an incredible learning experience, and frankly had the good fortune of having such a super company that people wanted to join the board, and people wanted to come run the company, that it wasn't a tough situation, but it certainly was an interesting one to participate in. Then the third one, the Excelis Technologies, was fascinating to me. It was a spin out of Eaton Corporation, and this was a company whose product was $5 million or $2 million, depending on what the flavor of the product was, per unit. And there weren't many units being sold, and they were being sold to companies like Intel or like Samsung, who are so much larger that the power was in the hands of the customer, even while your product was a great enabler for them. And sometimes they bought numbers of them, and sometimes they bought none. So it's a very much highly volatile from a revenue standpoint. And how do you handle the cost structure? At the same time, we were spending 10 to 20% of sales on new product development because of the changing needs and opportunities. And that company, in fact, had found in the middle 2000s that they had missed the boat in terms of what they offered, versus what, upon reflection, they wish they had offered. And so they had catch up. And I joined as they were gone through the realization stage and were in the, all right, I think we know what we're going to do stage. And so for the last several years, it's been watching them actually strengthen their team while they significantly strengthen their product and have regained market share and have gone from, gosh, are we going to be viable, to, hey, this is a pretty wonderful place. So, and again, we in that company, we had an activist shareholder come in as we had made our changes, but it hadn't been reflected yet in the financial results. So, and this was, boy, 5 years ago now. So you not only learned what it was like to deal with an activist shareholder, and that it wasn't pretty. On the other hand, interestingly for us, it caused a change which, at a governance standpoint, brought in the most, I think, a wonderful group of directors that we have now. It's particularly, I think, enabling for the management team. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it was very helpful, Joe. Thank you.
Sure.
So we're getting a little close to the end. I want to transition a little bit to something a little different. So now that we're currently in this coronavirus COVID-19 crisis, would you be able to talk a little bit about how the electronic test instrument industry and just, I guess, other tech industries in general are currently being impacted and how you see it changing these industries in the long run?
Sure. So in the short term, what COVID has done is to deal with a lack of demand, but frankly, for test and measuring, and I may think more about even the companies of which I'm on the board, the demand has been more constant than one might have thought, principally because of the build out of the new generation telecommunication, 5G. But having said that, the longer term effect of COVID-19 is, I think, making this global industry, and by that I mean the same products really are used by people in Japan, in India, in Germany, in the United States. And we're a supporter, an enabler for the electronics industry and the semiconductor industry. So our growth and our product offering is purely a function of their own innovation. And the restrictions that either nationalism or COVID are putting on industry generally, it's tough to quantify, but it certainly isn't helping. Because the notion, for example, the Trump administration just in the last few days saying that they really would prefer not to have students of other countries be here as students, and they put some bows and ribbons around constraints or not on that. But that doesn't help the flow of ideas. In addition, when I look at local competition, we have a situation now where there's the possibility in China that local manufacturers might be turned to by our customers because they fear access to our products over the longer term. Or for their own national reasons, they say, and I can think of China specifically, if we're going to have the best semiconductor industry and we are going to be self-sufficient, we need to have our equipment industry self-sufficient. So we will have to build that up as well. So that doesn't feel good for companies that depend on their customers from all over the world. COVID itself, one could think of as something that's on a day-to-day basis difficult to predict, terrifying for some, but you have to think that 5 years from now, COVID will be something that we look back on. And then the question I think that you're touching on is, are the behaviors of people using technologies which, just to give an example, faculty members at Case Western Reserve or high school teachers who have had to learn on the fly to do remote teaching might well find themselves being much more comfortable with it and learning how to make it go. So that might change the specific needs for equipment, which would then depend on the device, the instrumentation industry itself.
Great, thank you so much for that answer. Also, thank you so much for speaking with us today. This conversation was really insightful, and we really appreciate having had the opportunity to learn from you.
No, great, thank you. It's an absolute pleasure.
Great, and thanks, Anamisha, for moderating, and Joe, on behalf of our small but mighty Veale Institute team and all your friends on campus, we want to thank you for everything you do. I mean, it's actually interesting to be with each other on Zoom. One of the things that I've loved about your engagement on campus is your willingness to come to class. And I know you've done that both as a student for some art history classes. Your other love besides innovation and entrepreneurship and business is art, and your work and your family's work and your wife's work at the museum. And I often catch you on your way to class in an art history class. So I've always enjoyed you popping into our classes. And even though we're probably going to be in this Zoom format for a while, this is a great session to engage with you and hear about some of the things you've done in your career. So thank you for doing this today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Michael.